Hey, welcome to Raytown Christian Church. I'm Dr. Bill Tenney Britton. I am so excited that you've chosen to join us, that you've worshiped with us, and that you've hung out long enough to listen to me, to have a conversation with me. So I hope that you will hang out. I hope you'll take some notes, the handout, that you download the handout and you'll take the notes, and that you'll hang around afterwards, after this conversation, for the virtual cafe, and you'll have some conversation about what you're about ready to hear. So I have a question for you. Where did your faith begin? Where did your faith come from? From some of you, it began at home with your family. You were raised in the church. Your mom and dad, or your aunt or your grandparents, they immersed you in the faith. For some of you, it began at a church, and maybe you were dropped off as a kid for Sunday school or something, or you were raised in the church and you didn't get it from your family, you got it from the church. Some of you may have been a friend who took you to church, or someone who shared one-on-one with you, Campus Crusade for Christ or something along those lines that shared the faith with you. Or maybe you found your faith at a camp, or on some sort of a retreat, or some kind of a rally. Maybe your faith came at one of those big conferences or a revival service. But regardless of no matter how you got your faith, and there's also those of you who may not have faith yet. You may be struggling to find that faith, or wrestling with that, or trying to figure it out, and that's okay too. But regardless of where you are, and regardless of whatever faith you have, wherever it came from, it came to you or is coming to you because someone is investing in you. Someone investing in you and your life, in your relationship with God. For me, I can remember those who invested in my faith from years ago. My mom and my dad, they were active members of the church. They took us to church, and we prayed at home, and we talked about faith at home. We talked about the Bible a lot. We talked about God a lot. It was never like devotional kind of stuff that some of you may have had it in your home, or you've heard about that. And we never did that kind of a thing, but we talked the realities of faith regularly. My grandma Lillian, my mom's mom, my grandma, she really invested in me. In fact, I found out much later that she so much invested in me that she dedicated me to become a pastor. I didn't find that out until after I got ordained, but she was not surprised when I got ordained because she said, I knew it all along. I told God, I gave you to God when you were born. Okay. She had a lot invested, and she invested a lot in me. In first grade, I had a Sunday school teacher named Mamie Hunsinger. She invested in me. When I see her in heaven, I know that I'll be able to talk to her about how much of influence she had on my life, even back in first grade. Then there was Dan Anderson. He was a church planter. He was a pastor of a small, brand new church that my family and I went to, and it was under his ministry that I really got fired up about evangelism, and I ended up feeling called, knowing I was called into ministry because of his work. Once I had made that decision, I can tell you that Dr. Leroy Benefield, who was at the Florida Baptist College, he gave me the love for the church. He taught me evangelism, but he taught me about church growth and how important growing the church is, and why that the bride of Christ is worth investing in. And all these people invested in my faith. But you know what the truth is? My faith walk, the faith of my children and my grandchildren, the faith of my parents and my grandparents, it was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of the faithful whose investment in faith built the present. That in the past, there were people of faith who passed on their faith, who passed on their faith, who passed on their faith until today. In Christianity, I don't know where my faith came from. I don't know if it was from Peter or Andrew or Thomas or Bartholomew. I don't know where the line came, but one of those guys shared with someone who shared with someone who shared with someone who shared with someone, and eventually it came to me. I can't trace my lineage back to any of them. But I can tell you that my faith isn't just built on my mom and dad's or my grandmother's faith, but it goes all the way back. What about your faith stories? Who invested in you to build your faith? Kate, I want to invite you to pause the video and share with each other, where did your faith come from? Who invested in your faith? Raytown Christian Church, this church that puts together this video for you, it got its start in the 1870s. There were 4 smaller churches in what was called the Brookings Township. And they got together, and a Professor A.E. Higginson, I don't know, Albert, or maybe just went by A.E. But Professor Higginson, he was a Bethany College graduate from Virginia. He brought these 4 little churches, really small groups, under one roof. And 99 folks came together, and they chartered to start a new church, Raytown Christian Church. Since then, Raytown Christian, this church has helped to start 2 other churches. Helped to start Broadview Christian Church and South Summit Christian Church. And that, all of that, and our own existence, and so much more, has been built on the faith of those who came before us. The church that we're attending online right now came from people of the past. But Professor Higginson and the 4 churches, they didn't just pop out of nothing. They were building on the foundation that others had laid before them, all the way back to the New Testament, like I said. So I want to take a look at an introduction of what has been called our faith chapter, of where faith really came from, because I want you to have get an understanding of what faith is all about. So if you'll open the scriptures with me to Hebrews 11, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. Hebrews 11, 1 through 6. This is called the faith chapter. If you've been in church for any amount of time, you probably have parts of this maybe memorized, or at least it's very familiar to you. Now, faith. Faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. It is his faith and his faithfulness that we celebrate even today. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life. He didn't die. He did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. God just lifted him up off the planet. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now notice, we're reading a New Testament passage. It's in the New Testament, the back half of the book. And so this is a book that's written after Jesus had died and been resurrected and had gone on to heaven. But even New Testament faith didn't start from nothing. Christianity didn't start in a vacuum. It was built on the backs of those in the Old Testament, men and women from literally thousands of years ago. Faith came through them. But let's back up a minute. You know, we talk about faith all the time, as if we all know and agree on what we're talking about. But the writer of Hebrews wants his readers to be on the same page. He wants us to be on the same page. He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's what the ancients were commended for. They had confidence in what they couldn't see, what their senses weren't there providing them. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. Number one on your handout, there are two sides of faith. One side, which I call the intellect, and the other side, which is our hope. Now, when I say intellect, what I mean is of the mind. And I'm not talking about what you think. I'm talking about the brain, the physical brain. Our brain handles not just what we understand. It also has a lot to do with what we see and touch and smell and taste and hear. All of that happens up here. These are the receptors. I'm looking at you. Well, actually, you and I both know I'm looking at the camera. But be that as it may, I'm looking at the camera. I'm looking at you. I'm imagining you anyway. There's the mind at work. But the brain is, I see you. And it feels like I'm seeing you right here. But the reality is I'm seeing you back here somewhere. I don't know. If you're a medical person, you know which part of the brain that I'm seeing you in. And I'm hearing traffic outside and the water fountain down the hall going off now and again. And so that's also happening in the brain. Even though the sound's coming through the ears, the vibrations are vibrating inside there, it's being translated inside the brain. It's part of the intellect, if you will, part of the brain. It's what the world is saying to us through the sentences. It's about the here and the now. It's about the today. Hope, though, is the opposite. It's not about today. If you will, it's our spirit versus our senses. The spirit versus our intellect. Our spirit versus our body. It's a belief in God over the world somehow. And it's about the future. It's a hope for what's to come. It's not about the now. It's about the sometime. So to be a person of faith, you can't have one without the other, not if you're really a person of faith. It takes both. To really have faith, you have to have the intellect, you have to have the senses, but you also have to have the hope, and you have to mix that up and bring it together. But sadly, not everyone in a church has both. They don't necessarily have faith. There are those, and you may know, who are so sensible that there's no room for the Spirit. It's all about what I think and the tangible touch and what I understand and what I can prove, with paper and pencil or whatever. That there's no room for the Spirit in that. But you can also be so heavenly minded that you know earthly good. Faith is both. Faith is having the heavenly mindedness of what's to come and the senses that say, I don't understand, but I see and I hear, and that makes sense to me. It makes my faith real. It's what the writer is saying. You got to have your feet in both, one foot in one and one in the other. And that third verse illustrates what the first verse implied, that hope and intellect. It says, by faith we understand that the universe, that's the intellectual part, we understand that the universe, there are senses, we can look around and we can see our universe. And the writer goes on to say that the universe was formed at God's command, that what is seen is made out of what wasn't visible. My dad, again, was a scientist, and he pointed out something to us that I found very interesting, I've always held on to. He pointed out that scientists who are in the hard sciences, the biology and physics and astrology and chemists and that group, they tended to lean toward Christianity. Now, that's what he said. I don't think that's really what is true. I don't think that's really what he meant. What he meant was his colleagues in the sciences were pretty sure that there was something out there, some deity of some case, some godlike being. Because, well, in the hard science, you start doing hypotheses and you study the facts and the realities, you ponder, you come up with hypotheses and theories. And one of the problems with the Big Bang Theory, okay, now I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Big Bang Theory, but the Big Bang Theory, it presumes in its purest form that matter, things that were, the stuff we see, that it's pre-existed. That matter has always been there. It's just always been. And that's, for me, it's kind of humorous because there are those who are willing to make an assumption that matter has always been there, but not willing to contend that maybe a deity has always been there. Because, as my dad said, you get stuck with the Big Bang Theory. Because the Big Bang Theory says, there's all this matter, and it came together, and came together, came together, came together, and it essentially crushed and became like a white hole, and it exploded. And it went outwards from all different directions. And that's how our universe was formed. And the theory is that eventually it'll slow down, and it'll collapse. Again, the problem with that, is they found, is that they've looked at the stars, they're accelerating away from each other. So they haven't slowed down, and that messes with physics, because physics says after the Big Bang or whatever, that when you push a toy car, it immediately starts to slow down. And so, presumably it's supposed to slow down, but that's not the case. That's a different sermon for a different time, and obviously for a different person. But here's the deal: is where did that matter come from in the first place? Well, maybe there was another Big Bang. Great. But where did the matter come for the first Big Bang or the 14th Big Bang or whatever? The stuff comes up, goes out, comes up. Matter had to come from somewhere. Where did it come from? And that's where science goes, well, the writer of Hebrews obviously has an answer. He says, God spoke it. God said, and bang, it was there. And that God created something out of nothing. All right, so faith is a head thing and it's a heart thing. But you see, faith is more than just head and heart, because faith is also about attitude. Really. In verse 4, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain, his brother. Remember, Abel was the shepherd guy and Cain was the guy who raised crops, and they both brought an offering. And by faith, continue verse 4, by faith, he was commended, Abel was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. Cain and Abel, they brought an offering. Cain brought some of his crops. Traditionally, we've said wheat. He brought some sheaths of wheat. Abel brought a lamb. And if you read that specifically, go back to Genesis, I don't remember, 4 or 5, specifically brought the fat from the firstborn lambs. Fat. Just grabs up the fat and says, here you are, God. And apparently God favored Abel's offering. Have you ever wondered why Abel got the inside track and Cain didn't? Well, sometimes people think, well, it's because that Abel brought a live offering. He brought a lamb. Remember, there's no law at this point. This is pre-Moses. This is like the very beginning of time. There is no religion per se at this moment. They have the story of God. Adam and Eve walked with God, but there's no churches. There's no groups meeting, small groups meeting, no Bible studies, etc. So later on, when God gave Moses the rules for sacrifices, he put both bring crops and bring livestock on the list for sacrifices. People were supposed to bring grain and the fruits. So it wasn't that Cain brought the wrong thing. He brought the right thing. But the Hebrews writer, the writer of this passage, he lets us in on number of secrets. Number 2 in your handout. It was Abel's faith that made the offering acceptable to God. That's what that passage says. It was Abel's faith. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering. See, faith is also about right attitude. My mom used to say, she'd quote out of the book of Acts that God loves a cheerful giver. And my brother, who's kind of a comic, would say, yeah, but he'll take from an old grouch as well. And I thought that was, okay, yep, he will. But later on, going back to Abel and all that, and Moses, and later on, the Israelite congregation, the church of that day, they would get into trouble with God for the same thing, being an old grouch. Even though they were keeping the law, they were repeatedly told by the prophets, and you can find this in the prophecy, that God doesn't need your stinking offering. God doesn't need you. In fact, one of my favorite passages I think it's in one of the Psalms, it says, God needs no bull from you. Well, He doesn't need any of your bulls. He doesn't need any of your sheep. He doesn't need your wheat. He doesn't need your apples. God doesn't need any of that. God's not eating what you give him. It's not like he's, getting hungry at that. Someone put some smoky stuff up there so I can eat. What God is looking for and was always looking for were followers with good attitudes. There's no sense in coming to worship if your heart isn't in it. God doesn't need your worship either. Worship is supposed to be something you bring as an offering to God, as something that fills you and just adore God. Jesus would later say that there's a specific kind of worshiper that God is looking for. In John 4, it says, "Yet a time," this is Jesus talking, these are red letters in your Bible, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they're the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks." Time is coming when true worshipers will worship the Spirit of the Father in the Spirit and in truth. It's an attitude thing. That's the kind of worshipers the Father speaks. Number 3 in your handout, faith is intellect. It's the senses. It's hope. It is the future. And it's right attitude. Abel brought the best that he had. Even though that there was no previous requirement, it was from the heart. He brought something special. Then there's Enoch in the passage we just read, in the passage in Hebrews, and going through this people of faith. It says in verse 5, it says, "By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death." Quote, "He could not be found because God had taken him away." That's from the Old Testament. "But before he was taken, he was commended as someone who pleased God." Now, what makes a life acceptable to God? It seems to me that when intellect and hope and right attitude all come together, it comes together in our religion. Now, religion. There's a whole lot of people today who will try to say they're spiritual but not religious. And that's not only a cop-out, but it's just flat out untrue. Your religion, everyone's religion, and everyone has one, even an atheist. Religion is the practice of what you say you believe. It's not just what you say you believe, it's how you practice it. The truth is that most people, including most people in church, are practical atheists. They don't live their lives as if they really believe there's a God. They have the hope part down, but they hope there's a God out there somewhere. And they may even pray and read the Bible, they may even go to church, but if you watch their lives, if you watch how they make decisions and how they set their priorities, you'd have to conclude that their religion doesn't leave much room for God. They're not checking in on God and say, "Hey, I got to make a decision. Can you walk with me in this?" That intellectual thing, the seeing and the senses and looking at the bank account and going, I can't tithe because that confidence in God stuff, there's not a lot of that. Thoreau, Walden Pond, the philosopher writer guy from way back, he made an observation that most of us are living lives of quiet desperation. And that quote seems to be really spot on. That we just don't trust God. We don't live as if God exists. We live as if it all depends on us and that we need to take care of it. But when intellect and hope and attitude interact with your religion, with how you behave, that's when desperation ceases and you start walking with God. In Genesis 5:22, which is where the writer of Hebrews gets a lot of his words, it says, "After Enoch became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years. Enoch's religion was faith. He walked faithfully with God. He lived a life that was faithful. That's number 4 on your handout. Enoch's faith made his life acceptable to God because his head, his heart, his mind lined up with the way he chose to live his life. Jesus said it best, love the Lord your God with your heart and your mind and your soul and all your strength. The foundation of faith is understanding what faith really is, but it's not just an intellectual exercise. Love the Lord with your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. It's more than belief. It's more than confidence. It's more than hope, and it's more than attitude. It is all those things, but the kind of faith that God is looking for is the one that results in a life fully aligned with God. It's someone who walks with God. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, you've called us to be people of faith, but it's so hard to be a person of faith, to line up our head and our heart and our hope and our attitude and our behavior. Lord, help us to find the way to intersect those, to bring them together, that we might be faithful, that we might truly walk with God and please you. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I want to give you an assignment, like I always do. I want you to look at the handout, and there you have a couple questions to discover where is your faith really. And so I want to invite you to wrestle with the 3 questions. What is the main area in my life that's not fully aligned with God? Where is it that you're not aligned with God? What part of your life is just, What are you going to do about it? And here's the key, how will I make sure that I accomplish that? Who's going to hold me accountable? Who's going to help me put it together and hold me accountable for dealing with this in my life? I hope that you'll have a conversation about that at the cafe, the virtual cafe, and that you'll have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or whatever it is you're having, and have conversation about faith and your faith, where it came from, where it's going, and what are you going to do to maintain it and to build it. But before then, we're going to do an act of faith. We're going to share communion together, the bread and the cup. Let us join together and break bread and the cup and commune together and with the Lord.